She thought she was walking away from an ordinary man when she placed divorce papers into my hands. She never imagined that the shopping mall where she worked, the building she entered every single day, belonged to me all along. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we dive into today's story, I would like to ask you for a quick favor. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you will always be the first to know when we upload a new video. It only takes a moment, costs nothing, and is one of the best ways to help us continue creating touching and unforgettable stories for you. We truly appreciate your support. Also, we would love to know where you are watching from. Share your city or country in the comments below so we can say hello to viewers from around the world. Thank you so much for being here. Now, without further ado, let us return to our main character and begin today's story. I used to believe that the hardest signature a person could write was on a business contract, until my wife calmly slid divorce papers across a table and looked at me as if I had never been worth more than the uniform I wore. The shopping mall had not opened yet, but the building was already awake. Cleaning crews pushed their carts across polished marble floors. Bakers carried trays of fresh pastries into the food court, filling the air with the smell of warm bread and cinnamon. Security officers greeted early employees by name, while delivery trucks lined up behind the loading docks. Every morning looked the same to everyone else. To me, every morning was another chance to see the business from the ground instead of the top floor. I walked through the east entrance wearing the same navy maintenance jacket I had worn for years. My name tag simply read Malcolm. Nothing else. No expensive watch. No tailored suit. No executive badge. Just another employee arriving before sunrise. Most people barely noticed me, and that was exactly how I wanted it. A good owner learns more by listening than by announcing himself. I had spent years building Carter Properties into one of the largest commercial real estate companies in the region, yet I still preferred carrying a toolbox instead of a briefcase whenever I visited one of my malls. People acted differently when they thought nobody important was watching. That truth had made me successful long before it made me wealthy. As I stepped into the central atrium, one of the security supervisors straightened his posture the moment he saw me. His instinct was to greet me with the respect he always showed during executive meetings, but our eyes met for only a second before he understood. He simply nodded and said, "Morning, Malcolm." I smiled and returned the greeting without breaking stride. A few feet away, my wife never even looked up from the folder in her hands. Vanessa stood beside a cafe kiosk, dressed in the sharp black blazer that marked her as a store manager. She looked exhausted, but not from work. There was a distance in her expression that had been growing for months, one quiet conversation at a time. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her voice sounded polite, almost rehearsed. I set my toolbox beside an empty table in the food court. The chairs were still upside down, waiting for customers who would not arrive for another hour. She placed a manila envelope between us. I recognized the shape before I opened it. Divorce papers. No tears. No anger. No hesitation. Just neatly organized legal documents waiting for a signature. Vanessa folded her hands together and looked directly at me. "Malcolm, I cannot keep pretending this marriage is enough. I have worked too hard to spend the rest of my life struggling beside someone who is satisfied fixing light fixtures and replacing ceiling tiles." I listened without interrupting. She continued speaking as though she had practiced every sentence in front of a mirror. "I need stability. I need opportunity. I need a future that is actually growing. Love is important, but love does not pay for the life I want." Her words landed softly, almost gently, which somehow hurt more than shouting ever could. She believed every word she was saying. That was the painful part. She did not think she was being cruel. She believed she was being realistic. I looked down at the documents, then quietly reached into my jacket pocket for a pen. While I signed my name without argument, neither she nor anyone walking through that nearly empty mall realized the simple truth hidden in plain sight. Every light above us, every store surrounding us, every square foot beneath our feet belonged to me. I folded the signed papers, placed them back inside the envelope, and slid them toward Vanessa without asking a single question. She seemed almost surprised that I had not argued, begged, or demanded another chance. For a brief moment, she studied my face as if she expected disappointment to leave a visible mark, but all she found was the same quiet expression she had seen for years. "That is all?" she asked softly. I nodded once. If this is what you truly want, I will not stand in your way. She picked up the envelope, thanked me with uncomfortable politeness, and walked toward her store before the mall officially opened. I watched her disappear behind the security gate without calling her name. Some people believe the loudest endings hurt the most. They are wrong. The quiet ones stay with you much longer. I picked up my toolbox and continued the inspection route exactly as I had planned before sunrise. The ceiling lights outside the electronics store needed adjustment. A drinking fountain near the west entrance had been reported for low water pressure. A loose tile outside the children's bookstore required replacement before families arrived for the weekend. My calendar had not changed simply because my marriage had ended. As I worked, employees greeted me the same way they always had. The young cashier from the pretzel stand waved with a smile. A janitor asked whether I had enjoyed the basketball game the previous night. One of the maintenance technicians borrowed a wrench from my toolbox before returning it with a grateful handshake. Nobody treated me differently because nobody knew anything had happened that morning. That anonymity had always been one of the greatest gifts my hidden life allowed me to keep. Years earlier, when Carter Properties expanded across several states, my board of directors encouraged me to become the public face of the company. They wanted magazine covers, television, interviews, keynote speeches, and photographs hanging in every corporate office. I refused every suggestion. Buildings could carry my family name, but success never required my face. Instead, I quietly visited every property dressed like any other employee because I wanted to understand what numbers inside quarterly reports could never explain. I learned which entrances leaked during heavy rain, which food vendors treated customers with kindness, which managers inspired loyalty, and which policies created unnecessary frustration. The most valuable information never reached executive conference rooms. It lived inside ordinary conversations over coffee and break room lunches. That philosophy had shaped not only my business, but also my marriage. When Vanessa and I first met 5 years earlier, she believed I worked full-time in facilities management. Technically, I never lied. I did manage facilities. I simply never mentioned that I owned them. During our first apartment together, she often laughed because I insisted on fixing broken cabinets myself instead of hiring contractors. I cooked breakfast nearly every Sunday, mowed our small yard, and drove the same pickup truck I had owned since my early 30s. Money had never interested me nearly as much as freedom. Wealth could buy almost anything except genuine trust, and I wanted to know whether someone could love the man before discovering the fortune. For years, I believed I already had that answer. Around noon, I stopped at the employee cafeteria with a tray holding grilled chicken, vegetables, and iced tea. The room buzzed with ordinary conversations until a television mounted above the serving line switched to a local business report. A smiling anchor announced that Carter Properties would soon host its annual anniversary gala at Riverside Galleria, celebrating another record year of growth. Several employees looked up with admiration. One cashier joked that whoever owned the company probably spent every day flying between private islands. I smiled quietly and took another sip of tea. Across the cafeteria, Vanessa laughed with her coworkers, never realizing the man everyone was talking about was sitting less than 30 feet away. The days following the divorce settled into a rhythm that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside, yet every familiar hallway seemed to carry a different echo. I continued arriving before sunrise, walking the polished corridors with my toolbox in one hand and a notebook in the other, making quiet observations that would eventually become improvements across the property. Nothing about my routine changed because I had learned long ago that discipline was easiest to maintain when emotions were not allowed to rewrite the schedule. Vanessa, however, began moving through the mall with a new confidence that caught my attention from a distance. She no longer stopped to ask whether I had eaten lunch or whether I planned to work late. Instead, she spent more time talking with district supervisors, luxury brand representatives, and other managers who frequently visited the property. Every conversation seemed to revolve around promotions, executive networking, and opportunities that existed beyond the walls of her current store. One afternoon, while replacing a damaged ceiling panel outside a jewelry boutique, I overheard a conversation that was never meant for my ears. Vanessa and two coworkers stood only a few yards away, sipping coffee during their afternoon break. "You are still young," one of them told her. "You deserve someone who can give you the life you have been working toward." Another nodded in agreement. You spent years with a maintenance guy. Imagine where you could be if you met someone who actually belonged in the executive offices. Vanessa did not immediately respond. She stared through the glass storefront at the expensive watches displayed beneath bright lights before quietly saying, I kept telling myself that character mattered more than success. Maybe I was only making excuses because I was afraid to admit I wanted more. Her words were calm, but they carried the weight of months of private frustration. I continued tightening the final screw above my head without making a sound. They never noticed I had heard every sentence. That evening, while reviewing maintenance requests inside a small office hidden behind the loading docks, I found myself thinking less about the divorce itself and more about the quiet path that had led us there. Vanessa had not become shallow overnight. The change had been gradual, almost invisible. It began with social media photographs of classmates posing beside waterfront homes, vacations in Europe, and luxury cars parked in spotless driveways. Then came office conversations comparing salaries, neighborhoods, and investment portfolios. Little by little, contentment had started to look like failure through someone else's carefully edited photographs. I had watched it happen without realizing how deeply those comparisons had settled into her heart. The following Friday, the mall's executive assistant delivered invitations to every tenant for Carter Properties' annual anniversary gala. The event had become something of a legend among retailers because the company's owner almost never appeared in public. Stories circulated every year. Some believed the owner lived overseas. Others insisted he traveled exclusively by private jet and rarely visited the properties. A few claimed nobody knew what he even looked like. The mystery had become part of the company's reputation. As invitations spread from one store to another, excitement filled the building. Employees guessed which celebrities or business leaders might attend. Managers discussed dresses, tuxedos, and networking opportunities weeks before the event. I passed several groups comparing invitations while pretending to focus on replacing a burned-out light fixture. Vanessa held her invitation carefully, almost like a winning lottery ticket. One of her co-workers smiled and whispered, "This could change everything. Imagine impressing the owner personally. People say one conversation with him can transform an entire career." Vanessa smiled back, her eyes brighter than I had seen in months. "Maybe this is finally my chance," she answered. I looked away before she could notice me nearby, because I already knew something she could not possibly imagine. In just a few short weeks, the mysterious owner she hoped to impress would walk into that ballroom, and for the first time since the day we met, she would finally see the man she had spent years looking past. Life has a quiet way of testing whether your character changes after your circumstances do, and in my case, nothing about my circumstances had changed except the absence of the woman who had once shared my home. Monday morning still began before sunrise. I still parked the same aging pickup truck in the employee lot instead of the reserved executive garage hidden beneath the south wing. I still carried the same scratched toolbox through the service corridors while store employees rushed past with coffee cups in their hands, preparing for another busy week. The divorce papers had changed my legal status, but they had not changed the man I had spent decades becoming. Every day, I walked the property exactly as I always had, stopping to greet the maintenance crew by name, thanking the custodians who kept the marble floors shining, and asking the landscaping team whether the new irrigation system had solved the dry patches outside the main entrance. The people who worked here deserved to be seen, because they were the reason customers returned year after year. That belief had built Carter Properties long before impressive financial reports ever did. During one executive meeting held by video conference from a small office hidden behind the operations center, my senior leadership team discussed expanding into another state. They celebrated record revenue, rising occupancy rates, and strong investor confidence. I approved the construction budget, reviewed architectural drawings, and finalized contracts worth millions of dollars before closing my laptop and walking straight back into the hallway wearing the same maintenance jacket. Less than 5 minutes later, I was helping an elderly couple find the nearest elevator because one of the escalators had been temporarily shut down for inspection. Nobody looked twice at me. That simple contrast always reminded me why I preferred living this way. Titles opened doors, but humility opened hearts. Meanwhile, excitement about the anniversary gala continued spreading throughout the mall. Designers decorated storefront windows with elegant displays. Restaurants discussed special menus for invited guests. Luxury retailers polished every glass case until it reflected the ceiling lights like mirrors. The entire property seemed to carry an invisible current of anticipation. Employees traded rumors every lunch break about the mysterious owner of Carter Properties. Some believed he was in his 70s. Others insisted he was part of an old family dynasty that never appeared in public. A few claimed he had never even visited this location. Listening to those stories while quietly tightening loose handrails or inspecting emergency exits often made me smile. Sometimes the truth sounded too ordinary for people to believe. One afternoon, I received a confidential schedule from my executive assistant confirming every detail for the gala. My arrival time, security coordination, media restrictions, and the list of invited corporate partners filled several pages. I reviewed everything carefully before making one simple change. I instructed the team that no employee should receive special treatment because of my presence. The evening was meant to celebrate everyone who helped build the company's success, not the man whose name appeared on legal documents. A few hours later, while replacing light bulbs outside Vanessa's store, I noticed her studying a formal evening gown on her phone during a break. One of her coworkers leaned closer and smiled. "You are going to look incredible. Who knows? Maybe the owner will notice you." Vanessa laughed quietly, but there was hope behind the sound. "If I get the chance to meet someone like that," she said, "I want him to remember me." I kept working without lifting my eyes. She believed the gala might become the beginning of a better future. She did not realize it was quietly becoming the moment when every assumption she had built about me, about success, and about the choices she had already made would begin to unravel all at once. The week of the anniversary gala arrived with the kind of energy that transformed an ordinary shopping mall into something that felt almost theatrical. Fresh floral arrangements appeared near every entrance before sunrise. Polished brass railings reflected the soft glow of new lighting that had been installed only days earlier. Large banners celebrating another successful year of Carter Properties hung from the upper balconies, while contractors made final adjustments to the ballroom that had been built inside the renovated event center overlooking the indoor fountain. Every detail mattered because every detail represented the standards I had spent years protecting. Yet as I walked through the property carrying my familiar toolbox, not a single person glanced at me twice. That was exactly how I preferred it. The maintenance jacket still earned me casual smiles, quick greetings, and requests to fix loose shelves or flickering lights. It never earned assumptions about authority, and that anonymity continued teaching me more about people than any board meeting ever could. Throughout the day, I noticed employees speaking less about sales reports and more about the evening celebration. Conversations drifted toward expensive dresses, tuxedo rentals, business cards, and the possibility of meeting influential executives. Vanessa seemed especially determined to make the most of the opportunity. From across the corridor, I watched her reviewing inventory with unusual precision, coaching associates on customer service, and personally arranging every display until each shelf looked perfect. She wanted her store to reflect excellence, and I quietly respected the effort she invested. Ambition itself had never been the problem. Sometimes ambition simply lost sight of what truly deserved to be valued. Late that afternoon, I stepped into an empty conference room hidden behind the administrative offices and changed from my maintenance jacket into a simple charcoal suit that had been hanging inside a garment bag since early morning. Before I finished buttoning the jacket, my executive assistant, Angela Brooks, knocked softly before entering with a folder in her hands. "Everything is ready, Mr. Carter," she said. "The board members have arrived, the investors are checking in, and the media has been instructed to wait until after your opening remarks." I smiled politely before handing the folder back to her. "Thank you, Angela. One more request. Please do not announce my arrival before I enter the ballroom." She nodded without hesitation because she understood exactly why. The moment needed to happen naturally, not for dramatic effect, but because truth carried more weight when it arrived without warning. Meanwhile, Vanessa was finishing her shift. She disappeared into the employee locker room before emerging nearly an hour later wearing an elegant navy evening gown that reflected the soft lights above the corridor. Several coworkers immediately complimented her appearance, and she accepted their praise with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. One manager laughed and adjusted his tie before saying, Tonight could be the biggest networking event of your career. Vanessa smiled. I have spent years working toward opportunities like this. I just hope I finally meet someone who can open the right door. Hearing those words from a distance, I felt neither anger nor satisfaction. Instead, I felt something quieter. I realized she still believed powerful people only existed inside executive offices and luxury vehicles. She had never considered that genuine influence might spend years walking beside her without asking for recognition. Outside the grand entrance, luxury sedans and black SUVs began arriving one after another as business leaders, regional executives, and invited guests stepped onto the red carpet beneath rows of warm golden lights. Inside the ballroom, a string quartet welcomed attendees while conversations filled the elegant space with quiet confidence. Hidden behind a private entrance reserved for senior leadership, I adjusted my cufflinks one final time as Angela received a message through her earpiece. She looked toward me with a calm smile before speaking the words that would quietly change more than one life that evening. "Mr. Carter," she said, "everyone is waiting for you." The ballroom lights dimmed just enough for conversations to soften into whispers, and in that single quiet moment, every assumption in the room was only seconds away from collapsing under the weight of the truth. From behind the private entrance, I could hear the gentle sound of crystal glasses meeting in polite toasts, the distant melody of the string quartet, and the steady voice of the evening's master of ceremonies welcoming hundreds of guests who had gathered to celebrate another remarkable year for Carter Properties. Regional executives stood beside investors from across the country. Store owners who had built successful businesses inside our malls exchanged business cards with community leaders and nonprofit partners. Every person in that ballroom believed they knew what success looked like. Very few understood where it actually began. Angela glanced toward me one final time before the ballroom doors slowly opened. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage beneath the company logo and smiled confidently. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for joining us as we celebrate another year of growth, innovation, and partnership. Tonight would not be possible without the vision of one extraordinary individual. Please join me in welcoming the founder and owner of Carter Properties, Mr. Malcolm Carter." For a brief heartbeat, the room remained perfectly still. Then I stepped through the entrance wearing the same calm expression I had carried every morning while walking those familiar hallways in a maintenance jacket. The difference tonight was not the man. It was simply the suit. Within seconds, the silence gave way to respectful applause that spread across the ballroom like a wave. Board members rose to their feet first. Senior executives followed immediately. Investors extended their hands as I walked past them, thanking me for another successful year. Several city officials nodded with genuine respect before greeting me by name. None of those reactions surprised me because they had happened many times before. The only reaction I found myself noticing belonged to one person standing near the center of the ballroom. Vanessa did not clap. She did not move. The champagne glass in her hand remained frozen halfway between the table and her shoulder as every color slowly disappeared from her face. Her eyes searched mine again and again, as though expecting someone else to appear behind me. I watched recognition struggle against disbelief. The maintenance employee she had divorced only weeks earlier had somehow become the man every executive in the room had been waiting to meet. Nearby, one of her co-workers quietly whispered, "That cannot be possible." Another shook his head before answering, "That is Malcolm, Mr. Carter, the owner." The words spread from one table to another until conversations throughout the ballroom faded into astonished murmurs. I continued toward the stage exactly as rehearsed, stopping only long enough to shake hands with department directors, store partners, and community leaders who had contributed to the company's success. My attention never drifted toward Vanessa, although I could feel her eyes following every step. Once I reached the podium, the applause gradually settled. I looked across the audience that had placed so much importance on titles and appearances, then smiled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for being here tonight," I began. Every successful building is supported by people whose names rarely appear in headlines. Security officers who arrive before sunrise. Custodians who stay after everyone else leaves. Maintenance teams who solve problems before customers ever notice them. Store associates who greet strangers with kindness every single day. Success has never belonged to one person. It belongs to everyone willing to serve with excellence. My words filled the ballroom with thoughtful silence. Across the room, Vanessa slowly lowered her glass onto the table because her hands were no longer steady. For the first time since the day we met, she was not looking at a maintenance worker, an ordinary employee, or even her former husband. She was finally seeing the man who had quietly walked beside her all those years without ever asking the world to recognize his worth. The applause slowly faded, but the silence that followed carried far more weight than any standing ovation ever could. I stepped away from the podium and spent the next hour greeting business partners, shaking hands with community leaders, and thanking employees whose dedication had helped build another successful year. Every introduction sounded familiar. Every conversation centered on future projects, charitable partnerships, and plans for continued growth. Yet no matter where I stood inside the ballroom, I could feel the quiet gravity of one pair of eyes following me through the crowd. Vanessa remained near the same table where she had first seen me enter, as though moving even a few feet might somehow make the evening feel more real. Around her, conversations continued, but they no longer sounded the same. Co-workers who had once joked about the mysterious owner now spoke in hushed voices, replaying every memory they had ever shared with the maintenance employee named Malcolm. One manager quietly admitted that I had once helped carry heavy display shelves after a delivery arrived late. Another remembered seeing me cleaning spilled coffee from the floor because the custodial staff had been busy responding to another emergency. A security officer smiled to himself as he recalled how I insisted on eating lunch in the employee cafeteria instead of the executive dining room during corporate inspections. Piece by piece, their memories began fitting together into a picture none of them had ever considered before. Vanessa listened without interrupting. The more stories she heard, the more painful the truth became. None of my actions had changed that evening. The only thing that had changed was what people believed those actions meant. Later in the evening, one of the board members approached me with several investors from Chicago and introduced me as the founder whose leadership philosophy had become required reading for newly promoted executives throughout the company. One investor smiled and asked, "Is it true that you still spend time working anonymously inside your own properties?" I nodded. It is the only way to understand whether our values are real or simply written in employee manuals. The group laughed softly before agreeing that very few executives would choose that path after achieving financial success. Across the ballroom, I noticed Vanessa lower her eyes. I recognized the expression immediately. It was not embarrassment caused by public attention. It was the quiet realization that countless moments from our marriage now carried completely different meanings. She remembered the weekends when I insisted on repairing neighbors' broken fences without accepting payment. She remembered how I stopped to help strangers change flat tires during road trips instead of driving past them. She remembered every evening I came home tired because I had spent the day replacing damaged ceiling tiles alongside maintenance crews instead of sitting behind a polished executive desk. None of those memories had been performances. They had simply been my life. A few minutes later, Angela approached and whispered that several department managers hoped to thank me personally before the evening ended. As I turned toward the reception line, I noticed Vanessa slowly walking in my direction. She hesitated after every few steps, as though uncertain whether she still had the right to stand in front of me. The confident woman who had calmly placed divorce papers across a table only weeks earlier now looked like someone searching for answers that should have been obvious all along. She finally stopped only a few feet away. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The music continued softly behind us while conversations filled the ballroom with distant voices. Then she looked into my eyes and quietly asked the question that had clearly been growing inside her since the moment I stepped onto the stage. "Why did you never tell me?" I met her gaze without anger, without satisfaction, and without the desire to make her feel smaller than she already did. I simply understood that some truths arrive too late to prevent heartbreak, but never too late to reveal character. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The conversations around us blended into a distant hum while the soft music continued drifting through the ballroom, but everything beyond the few feet separating us seemed to disappear. Vanessa searched my face as though she might still discover some explanation that would make the evening less overwhelming. I finally answered her question with the same honesty that had guided every decision I had ever made. I never told you because I wanted to know whether the man was enough before the title ever mattered. She lowered her eyes for a moment, then slowly looked back at me. Did you think I was being tested? She asked quietly. I gently shook my head. No, love is not a test. It is simply revealed by the choices people make when they believe nobody is watching. She stood silently, allowing those words to settle between us. After several seconds, she let out a slow breath. I thought you were hiding something from me. I smiled with quiet understanding. I was protecting something, not hiding it. There is a difference. Every time someone recognized my position before they recognized my character, I never knew whether they were speaking to Malcolm or to my bank account. I wanted one place in my life where I could simply be myself. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she made no attempt to hide them. I remember every weekend you spent helping people, she whispered. I remember complaining because you came home with paint on your clothes or dust on your boots. I thought you lacked ambition. I answered gently. Ambition was never the problem. We simply measured success differently. She nodded slowly, as though replaying years of memories through an entirely new perspective. I thought success meant moving higher, she admitted. You believed success meant staying grounded. I looked around the ballroom where executives continued greeting employees with smiles, where store associates celebrated another successful year, and where the company I had built continued growing because thousands of ordinary people performed extraordinary work every day. Buildings rise because their foundations stay low, I said. People are no different. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly before speaking again. I judged you by your uniform. I answered without hesitation. Many people did. I never blamed them for that. Clothing is easy to see. Character takes longer. She looked toward the ballroom entrance where only weeks earlier she would have imagined someone powerful arriving through those doors. A faint, bittersweet smile crossed her face. All this time, I thought I was waiting to meet an extraordinary man. I quietly replied, you already had. You simply believed extraordinary had to look different. Neither of us raised our voices. There was no accusation, no bitterness, and no satisfaction in proving anyone wrong. The truth no longer needed emotion to support it. It simply existed. Angela approached respectfully and reminded me that several scholarship recipients sponsored by the Carter Foundation were waiting for introductions. I thanked her and turned back toward Vanessa one last time. She hesitated before speaking again. I do not know whether you can ever forgive me. I met her eyes with complete sincerity. Forgiveness is not the difficult part. Holding on to anger only makes life heavier. I forgave you the day you handed me those papers. She looked genuinely surprised. Then what cannot be repaired? She asked. I paused before answering because some truths deserved careful words. Trust does not disappear because someone has less money than we expected. It disappears when we discover that love depended on what could be counted instead of who someone truly was. I hope you build a wonderful life, Vanessa. I truly do. But the future we imagined together ended long before tonight. This evening only revealed why. She quietly nodded, understanding that I was not closing a door out of revenge. The door had already closed the moment appearances became more valuable than the person standing beside her, and no amount of wealth revealed afterward could rewrite the choices that had already been made. 1 year later, I still arrived before sunrise more often than anyone expected from the owner of a company that now managed properties across multiple states. The maintenance jacket had returned to its familiar place in my truck, and although I no longer wore it every day, I never allowed success to create distance between myself and the people whose work gave every building its purpose. Some mornings I walked the corridors with a clipboard, other mornings with a toolbox, and occasionally with nothing more than a cup of coffee while greeting security officers finishing the night shift. The marble floors reflected the same early morning light they always had, reminding me that buildings changed slowly, but people could change much faster if they were willing to learn. Carter. Properties continued expanding, yet the achievement that brought me the greatest satisfaction had nothing to do with another acquisition or another record-breaking financial report. Instead, we launched a scholarship program for the children of hourly employees, increased emergency assistance for workers facing unexpected hardships, and created leadership training that allowed custodians, cashiers, and maintenance technicians to build careers they had once believed were impossible. Every announcement reminded me why I had started the company in the first place. Success became meaningful only when it created opportunities for others. Vanessa remained with the company for several months after the gala, but she requested a transfer to another city before eventually accepting a management position with a different retailer. I approved the paperwork without hesitation. She deserved the chance to begin again somewhere she could build a future without carrying the weight of constant memories through every hallway. Before her final day, she left a handwritten letter on my desk. She did not ask for another chance. She did not ask to return. She simply thanked me for teaching her a lesson that no promotion, paycheck, or title could have revealed. She wrote that she had spent too much of her life measuring people by what they appeared to possess instead of by the values they carried every single day. She admitted that losing our marriage had forced her to recognize how quietly character reveals itself through ordinary moments that most people never notice. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a drawer rather than throwing it away because some chapters deserve to be remembered, even after they have ended. I wished her happiness with complete sincerity, not because the past no longer mattered, but because bitterness would never improve either of our futures. Several months later, while walking through the mall during another routine inspection, I noticed a young maintenance technician helping an elderly customer carry several shopping bags to her car without anyone asking him to do it. Afterward, I thanked him for taking the extra time. He smiled and shrugged. "I have seen you do the same thing for years," he said. "I figured that is just how we treat people around here." His words stayed with me for the rest of the day because they reminded me that leadership is rarely defined by speeches delivered from a stage. More often, it is reflected in small actions repeated so consistently that they quietly become part of someone else's character. Looking back now, I do not remember the divorce papers as the moment my life fell apart. I remember them as the moment the truth finally became impossible to ignore. Wealth never revealed my worth. It only exposed the assumptions other people had already chosen to make. The greatest blessing was never owning the shopping mall or building a successful company. It was discovering that peace does not come from proving people wrong. It comes from knowing who you are long before the world finally recognizes it. Some fortunes can be counted on financial statements, measured by square footage, or celebrated with applause inside elegant ballrooms. The ones that truly endure are built with integrity, protected by humility, and shared through kindness. Those are the only riches that never lose their value.